Hello, welcome back to the book log. Today I am going to be talking about Needful Things by my good friend Stephen King. Regardless of anything else, Needful Things is probably the most quintessentially Stephen King book I've read so far. It's incredibly long. It has an interwoven ensemble cast of characters whose inner lives and motivations are explored in great detail. It takes place in a small town in Maine, Castle Rock, the setting for several early King novels such as The Dark Half and The Body. It's gruesome, it's campy, it has a lot of inter-King universe references. It's a slow burn, good versus evil epic. It's got a kind of a weird ending, which I'll get to later. Basically, it's just the whole package. It's not my favorite Stephen King book, but it's perhaps the most singularly representative of his whole deal. And for that, I have to respect it. And strangely enough, it's a book that King himself has referred to before as a comedy. That might seem like a difficult circle to square considering the whole King of Horror thing, but I think it does fit. It's probably a little bit plottier than most of his books. Events and occurrences tie together so neatly throughout that it eschews the kind of figure it out as you go attitude King seems to like to employ on occasion, but even that works in this book's favor, I would say. Now, I'm going to backtrack a little bit here. When King calls this book a comedy, I don't strictly agree with that characterization. It has a lot of very heavy-handed satirical elements, specifically about consumerism and materialism and greed, but it does tread into some genuinely dark territory. It takes a while to get to that stuff, though. The book does start off in a sort of disarmingly innocent way. Basically, a new store has opened up in Castle Rock called Needful Things, and its proprietor is just this amiable old man named Leland Gaunt. The store's inventory is a bit eccentric, but it's more or less like an antique store or a novelty shop or something like that. King starts the story off at a pretty leisurely pace, getting you into the heads of all the many residents of Castle Rock, giving you a sense of their personality, and then one by one, they begin entering Needful Things and purchasing some strange objects. It's clear pretty early on that there's some supernatural component to Needful Things, and the way it works is that when someone enters the store, there's always some object for sale that the person desperately wants. Usually it's pretty innocuous stuff like the middle schooler, Brian Rusk. He's one of the main characters in the story. He's the first customer of the shop, and he buys a signed Sandy Koufax baseball card, complete with an autograph made out specifically to a boy named Brian. Another woman in town gets a beautiful carnival glass lampshade. Another woman gets a framed picture of Elvis. These seem to be objects that the townspeople covet in some way, and the conceit of the store is that nothing has a listed price. Everything is negotiable. It's just about how much you think you need it. These objects are always sold at a surprisingly, suspiciously reasonable price on the condition that the recipient play a little prank on somebody else in Castle Rock, generally a stranger. And this is where the real fun of the story comes in, because Leland Gaunt somehow knows the personal histories of Castle Rock's residents. He knows grudges, he knows grievances, he knows people's insecurities and their fears, and he uses that information to pit people against each other. The pranks that he has his customers play are specifically designed to escalate people's pre-existing resentments in the hopes that they'll violently confront one another. The first time we see this fully play out, it involves a grudge between two middle-aged women of Castle Rock named Nettie Cobb and Wilma Jerzyk. They already didn't like each other for various reasons, so when Leland Gaunt made Brian Rusk severely vandalize Wilma's home, and then later made another local Hugh Priest kill Nettie's dog, the two women's first instinct was to blame each other, and then it leads to this incredibly gruesome confrontation just in the middle of a suburban street. And that's just one example of dozens of the same scenario. Nearly every single resident of Castle Rock at some point has a mean trick pulled on them and then pulls a mean trick on someone else in return, leading to this enormous spider web of petty grievance and animosity that Leland Gaunt uses to turn the town of Castle Rock in on itself. He even stokes the flames between entire organizations like the Catholic and the Baptist churches, contention over casino night. I wouldn't quite say it's a slow burn because some pretty intense action happens relatively quickly, but the things Leland Gaunt has people do to pay for their items does get increasingly dark and dramatic as the story moves forward. The whole book is just plotted very tightly, and you get a really keen sense of the entire town falling apart at the seams as everyone's anger spirals out of control. Sheriff Alan Pangborn of the Dark Half fame is the de facto protagonist of this book, and he's a nice enough character. Again, his relationship with Polly Chalmers is fleshed out. He has this dark and complicated backstory of grief over the untimely death of his wife and son, and he's a good, pure foil to Leland Gaunt's like overt evil. I do think it's interesting how Pangborn and Gaunt, ostensibly the two main characters, never see each other nor interact for almost the entire duration of the whole book. As usual with his ensemble works, there are a lot of characters who get a lot of attention, and it'd be impossible to fully delve into all of the interconnected story threads, but just to highlight a few, I love the paranoid town selectman Danforth Buster Keaton and the way that Gaunt is able to use his delusions about this mysterious they who are out to get him as a force for destruction. I enjoyed the inclusion of Ace Merrill, another Castle Rock staple. He's just such a strong antagonist to me, and he's tied up in so much of the history and the lore of the town that it was really fun to see him around and wreaking havoc. Polly Chalmers, who I already mentioned briefly, was another very key character to the story. She's an example of one of the more evil components to Gaunt's dark magic, as rather than an obsession over an object like most of the other Castle Rock residents, Gaunt is selling Polly relief from her horribly debilitating arthritis. King just does a very good job of portraying the emotional turmoil that situation puts her in. I thought the story arcs of Brian Rusk and Hugh Priest were both incredibly sad, and then conversely, the drama between Sally Radcliffe, Lester Pratt, Frank Jewett, George T. Nelson, a lot of the dynamics were just very silly and absurd and strange, which, it kind of goes to further highlight the massive variety of things occurring throughout the town, all funneling in and around the store Needful Things. Now, there were a couple of aspects to this book that confused me a little bit. First, there seemed to be a sort of contradiction to me in the way Needful Things operated. At first, the book reads as though it's supposed to be a commentary on obsessive consumerism, and the buyers had to wrestle with the guilt of pranking others in order to attain their coveted material objects. For instance, Brian felt guilty about throwing mud at Wilma's sheets. Hugh Priest felt guilty about killing Nettie's dog. But as the book went on, the aspect of choice, the idea that you can access some inner willpower and free yourself from your greed, was kind of abandoned in favor of Leland Gaunt just straight up hypnotizing people to do his bidding. I think it was somewhat necessary both to demonstrate Gaunt's supernatural power, but also to avoid having to justify the incredibly dark pranks he was having people do. But I did still like the initial setup a little bit better, I think. And then the other thing that confused me, this is a very common complaint about this book, was the ending, like specifically the last 10 pages, like the very, very, very end. It didn't ruin the book for me or anything, but the entire climactic set piece was just kind of a head scratcher. Alan suddenly uses some weird, silly magic kid's toy to defeat Gaunt. Felt a little unplanned, a little anticlimactic, even if I did still appreciate the bizarre imagery of the whole thing. Like I said at the beginning of this review, this is just such a Stephen King branded book that I'm almost required to love it. The way that he's able to so vividly capture this community, this town, to paint such a detailed picture of the interiority and the emotions and the motivations of so many different people and manage to keep it all afloat under the weight of such an elaborate plot is, as usual, quite incredible. It even has the King brand weird ending to top it all off. I had a great time reading this. It was dark and intense, but also strange and funny and complicated. I loved all the zigs and zags and twists and turns. I love these like heartfelt moments sandwiched between absurd moments. It just really has it all. The book begins and ends with the line, "You've been here before," and the way King writes, he just like really makes you believe that. We'll give this book a strong 8.